Attorney Harding.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, and once again, thank you. I appreciate the time and effort you put into this case. The defendant, Dale Holloway, has failed to prove by clear and convincing evidence that his actions on October 12, 2019 were the product of any mental disease or defect. Period. That's the question here today. And that's the answer. Dale Holloway failed to prove by clear and convincing evidence that he even suffered from a mental disease or defect. The judge is going to give you an instruction once Mr. Holloway finishes his closing argument. And the judge is going to give you a definition of clear and convincing evidence, what that actually means. It means more than, well, I think it's probable that his actions on October 12th, the shooting, the assault, were the product of a mental disease or defect. No, it's more than that. It's got to be that it was highly probable that his actions that day were the result of a mental disease or defect. And he can't sustain that burden, simply put. In fact, keep in mind, and this is something the judge is going to tell you, Mr. Holloway is presumed to be sane. Just as he was presumed to be innocent during the guilt phase, at this phase, he is presumed to be sane. And he's got to overcome that presumption by showing you evidence that his actions that day, October 12th, were the result of a mental disease or defect. And he just can't do it. Please keep in mind the closing argument that I'm giving you here today. It's not evidence. I'm coming up with arguments as to why Mr. Holloway is going to be unsuccessful in sustaining his burden. And just as my argument is not evidence, nor is his argument evidence. So if he comes up and starts providing you with what could be considered testimony about his mental disease or defect, and how his actions could be considered to be the result of a mental disease or defect, disregard that. Just as he was exaggerating his symptoms with his two doctors, Dr. Tabashnik and Dr. Mart, and as Dr. Bader found as well. In fact, I would submit to you, you saw an example yesterday of Mr. Holloway exaggerating when he said that I think his quote was, "I was locked in a cell since the age of 9. Well, that's false. That's an exaggeration. I mean, it might have been somewhat of an artful attempt on his part to show what his life has been like, but it's false. I mean, that's even inconsistent with his other testimony, which is how he's gone to Texas and how he's been to Hampton performing. So that was a real-time example. You saw and heard Mr. Holloway just making up stuff. Perhaps in an effort, in his mind, to say what he thinks needs to be said to convince you of what he thinks he needs to convince you of. So his doctors, Dr. Tabashnik and Dr. Mart, addressed the issue of Mr. Holloway feigning symptoms. And I think it was Dr. Tabashnik who scored him probable feigning symptoms on 4 of 8 scales on a test. To be clear, I mean, this is his own expert. This is his own doctor who was meeting with him. And maybe you could say, all right, maybe Mr. Holloway was flustered, maybe he made a mistake, he was over-emotional when he was answering questions from Dr. Tabashnik, but that wasn't the only time that he exaggerated his symptoms, was it? He did the same thing with Dr. Mart. In fact, Dr. Mart testified how Mr. Holloway's failure on 3 different measures of psychiatric symptom exaggeration makes it clear that his self-report of symptoms of psychosis cannot be taken at face value. And even if Dr. Mart found some signs of a thought disorder. His report or his evaluation was really incomplete. It was only his clinical judgment. That's really all we could base it on. So, when you go to a doctor, when we go to a doctor ourselves, it's not like our doctor or PCP looks at us and goes, I don't know, I think you've got cancer, or I think you've got some sort of other disease. I mean, there's going to have to be some testing involved to support that. But that's not what Mr. Holloway helped out. He was exaggerating his symptoms. Again, perhaps in an effort in his mind to convince someone that he thought was going to help him prove his point, which was that, in his mind, that he was insane. That's his defense. So you just can't rely upon what they had to provide. Or at the very least, it was incomplete. In fact, Dr. Tabashnik's report was only a draft. Even there, she still found signs of malingering on his part. And Dr. Mart's report, and I think he acknowledged this when he was up on the stand, but he looked, I think when you were talking about records, he looked at the transcript of the recorded statement that Mr. Holloway gave. He didn't listen to the actual recording, though. Who did that? That was Dr. Bader. Dr. Bader, who was the former chief of the Office of Forensic Examiner. She's the president of the American Academy of Forensic Psychologists. Well-trained, well-experienced. She came in here and just gave you, just provided you with how it's supposed to be done, how an examination is supposed to be done. So she talked about how she gathered all the records, and she listened to the jail calls. She listened to that recorded statement that Mr. Holloway gave. Not just the transcript, as Dr. Mart had, but she actually listened and could hear Mr. Holloway's words, because that helped inform her opinion. It was important for her to gather all the records in this case, all the documents, all the material in this case. She also, and this was not something done, or at least testified to by either Dr. Tabashnik or Dr. Mart, but she also looked at the Bridgewater Hospital records. She talked about, oh, that's really important, because that's day-to-day observations of clinicians. And she admitted this material was old, but still critical information for her, in her opinion. And she talked about how they found no evidence of mental illness. Again, that's information about Mr. Holloway. His hospital records just don't back up what he wants you to believe. And then Dr. Bader, given all her training, given all her experience, given the fact that she's reviewed all this material, she opined that based on all of that, that even though he may have some personality disorders, such as the antisocial personality disorder and the narcissistic behavior, as well as the disorder that's a step down from PTSD, his actions on October 12, 2019, are not the product of any mental disease or defect. That's Dr. Bader's opinion. Now the judge is going to give you an instruction and say, hey, expert witness testimony, that's relevant or really important information for you to consider. But you can consider any evidence of insanity. So it's wide-ranging here. You're not just limited to what the doctors have to say. And so you can consider the testimony of the other witnesses who testified. You can consider all the other evidence that was presented to you. And let me just comment very briefly about Patricia Garcia, just testified minutes ago, that Gail was depressed and angry. How could he not be? That's certainly a rational response to the death, the killing of Luis Garcia, a man that Mr. Holloway has spent the last pretty much 8 days talking about, eulogizing. Most of us, I would imagine, have suffered from some sort of grief. Who cannot imagine, who cannot empathize with that sort of feeling, that sort of loss, that grief, that anger, really, because there was a killing involved here. And someone did this to Luis Garcia, a man that Mr. Holloway loved. Of course he's going to be angry. Of course he's going to be depressed. Of course he's going to be sad. That is certainly a rational response to that trauma. But let me go beyond that. Now, the judge is going to provide you, as I said, a number of different examples that you can consider some of the evidence that was presented to you. Let me go through some of them right now. You can consider the nature of the acts. What does that mean? This means going back to what happened on October 12, 2019 when Mr. Holloway went to the church. Here's a counterexample of the nature of the acts that would show bizarre behavior. If Mr. Holloway said to Mr. Carpio, hey, can you give me a ride down to Pelham to my father's memorial service? I have to roll up on someone. You've seen the text, the screenshot of the text message. And Mr. Carpio drove Mr. Holloway in that BMW down to Pelham from Manchester. They drove into the church parking lot, and then Mr. Holloway pulled out a loaded gun and fired it at Mr. Carpio. That would be an example of bizarre behavior, unmoored from reality. I mean, here's a man, Mr. Holloway, who's angry, he's depressed, he's sad, and then he decides to shoot Mr. Carpio. You could think, oh, that doesn't track. That's just not logical. That's unmoored. So that, when you consider the nature of that act that we just described, Mr. Holloway shooting Mr. Carpio, that's bizarre. So that, in considering that, you go, yeah, okay. I mean, that's odd. That bears looking into. But here, it really all tracks, doesn't it? Mr. Holloway, angry at the Castiglione family, specifically at Brandon, for killing his father, but then focuses his anger upon Mark and Claire, and then focuses his anger on the bishop because they're putting the wedding right before the memorial service, which in Mr. Holloway's mind, that's a sign of disrespect. So horrible what he did on October 12th. Tragic. Still, you kind of understand it. I mean, it tracks. He's angry, he's upset, he wants revenge, so he gets a loaded firearm, he gets a ride down from Manchester down to Pelham, goes to the church, and then walks in and shoots. It all tracks. The nature of those acts seem logical, though hard. Another example that you may want to consider was Mr. Holloway suffering from delusions or hallucinations. His mom actually talked about that, saying no. And then Dr. Bader followed up on that and found that these voices that Mr. Holloway had complained of, well, these were voices in his dreams. Not voices as he's just standing here listening to. No, that's not the case. In fact, Dr. Bader talked about that as well. Like, she was listening to the recorded interview and she was like, oh yeah, there's no pausing here during the interview after the shooting. It's not as though she heard anything there that suggested that he was listening to any auditory hallucinations. None of that. Did Mr. Holloway know the difference between right and wrong, and did he have the power to choose between right and wrong? I would point you to the testimony of his probation officer, P.P.O. Myers. We asked him questions about how Mr. Holloway had been supervised from 2018 to 2019, pretty much all the way through almost into October. And Mr. Holloway had to follow the rules and regulations of probation and parole. And he did. He followed all of those rules. And so he knew the difference between right and wrong. He had the power to do this. So again, this example here, this factor shows that Mr. Holloway was in complete control of his faculties. That he knew the difference between right and wrong and acted accordingly. He could conform his behavior to the social mores of our society, and he did so. Did Mr. Holloway know the nature of his acts? Yes. I'll point you back to his question to Deputy Chris Solomon. He was the deputy sheriff that was with Mr. Holloway at the hospital, and Mr. Holloway at that point asked, "Did I kill anyone?" Recognizing that he had done what he had done, and asking, what did actually happen? Showing that he knew the nature of his acts. What else did Solomon testify to Mr. Holloway saying? He was lucky the gun jammed. He knew the nature of his acts. Did Mr. Holloway act impulsively, or did he act with cunning in planning and executing the crimes? Mr. Holloway, in fact, talked about how he had, after the death of Luis Garcia, he did a couple of hours of Facebook research. He wrote down the notes that he had gathered from the Facebook research. These were the notes. I think those are Stacy's of it too. These were the notes that were in his wallet at the time he was arrested, immediately after the shooting. Mr. Holloway texted Mr. Carpio asking for a ride from Manchester down to Pelham, saying that he wanted to roll up on someone. And once he got down to the church parking lot, Mr. Holloway got rid of, what did he get rid of? The 2 cell phones and the speaker. He left those behind, which Mr. Carpio told you looked odd. But he kept the firearm, didn't he? The loaded firearm. He kept that. Recognizing that that's a weapon, recognizing that that's something that he needed. That was his tool that he needed to use to get his revenge. And it's not like he just burst in like a berserk fashion. If you recall the church surveillance footage, you see Mr. Holloway walking sedately, calmly from Mr. Carpio's BMW into the church. In fact, you can recall the witnesses who testified that Mr. Holloway walked in and he was dressed differently than one would expect to a wedding. And that's why they noticed him. And then he sat down, and he sat down for several minutes. In fact, if we recall Christine Merchant's testimony, Mr. Holloway seemed relaxed. He had his arm propped up on a pew. So again, it's not like he was just so full of rage at that point that he couldn't control his emotions. He walked in. He sat down. He observed. He did not act impulsively. He was able to contain his emotions. He was able to conform his conduct accordingly. Until he walked up to the altar, walking off to the side, fumbling in his pocket to get the gun out, walking with a purpose, as Othniel Archer described, and then walked up to people and raised the firearm and pulled the trigger. And then When it jammed, he tried to unjam it. Did he recognize acquaintances? That's another factor the judge will mention. We'll talk about that now. Again, he recognized a neighbor, Mr. Carpio. He recognized and reached out to him. He recognized, one would think, the wedding party and Bishop Choate. I mean, it sounds basic, but in terms of this particular factor, I want to kind of step through and state it all clearly. I mean, he recognized these people. These were the targets of his anger. It's not as though, just going back to the example of Mr. Carpio getting shot, it's not as though Mr. Holloway just shot at someone else in the parking lot. He shot at people that he actually recognized. The two calls that we introduced yesterday through Peter Carria, you can listen to those again. He recognized those people. I think one of them was Rhonda, the Sophia family members that he recognized and spoke with. In fact, I think there was some, if I heard correctly, there was a child that was on there as well, and Mr. Holloway recognized that person as well. In fact, during these calls, Mr. Holloway, in an unguarded moment, revealed the truth, really, that he wasn't insane. He was grieving, talking about what had happened on October 12th. You can also look at the group photos that Mr. Holloway introduced showing him with family members. I mean, he recognized those. Another factor, and we spent a lot of time talking about this yesterday with Mr. Holloway, where could he transact business and could he manage his affairs? In fact, his mother just said that he could manage his affairs. But Mr. Holloway talked a lot, like we had a conversation going on here about him working for Moe's, him doing construction, him working for the Tuckaway Tavern, him working for the Fisher Cats. This is all work that he's doing in the 2018 to 2019 period. It shows that he can follow directions. He can do what he's asked to do. In fact, with the Fisher Cats, he's interacting with customers. At Moe's, he's interacting with customers. More to the point, though, a clearer example is Mr. Holloway talking about his life as a performer, really an entrepreneur. He talked about, and I'm not going to repeat everything, but it clearly showed that Mr. Holloway had an idea to promote himself as a rap artist and was heavily invested in that. And so like he would travel down to Texas, and I think he described how he went into different bars to give out his CDs to market himself, which kind of argues against him being paranoid if he's so concerned about getting stabbed. And it seems that would, going down to South by Southwest and putting yourself out there is a little bit inconsistent with that, but set that aside for a moment. But he was going out, he was negotiating with people, he was negotiating with DJs, with bartenders, with help to help him with his business. In fact, Dr. Bader also, when she was listening as part of her due diligence, she talked about listening to jail calls in which Mr. Holloway was talking about how he's transacting business regarding his music. Did Mr. Holloway experience some emotional blows in his life? Yes. He testified very movingly about death of a friend, death of a cousin, and yet he was able to overcome those. In fact, he talked about how music really was an outlet for him to help manage his stress. I want to be careful here to note, are there people out there who truly suffer from mental disease and defect? And their actions are the result of a mental disease or defect? Yes. There are people that are so situated that do suffer from that. Mr. Holloway is not one of those people. And he's failed to prove that. Again, because the burden is still on him to show by clear and convincing evidence that his actions were the product of any mental disease or defect. Let me suggest this to you. When you think about this case, when you think about Mr. Holloway, you may think of him as a performer, where he's really exaggerating things as part of his performance. He was a headliner at Hampton, performing. I'd argue he was a headliner here in court, performing. He also was performing on October 12th, 2019. That was part of his performance. And so for this stage, Mr. Holloway is just that. He's a performer. He's got some issues, he's had some hard blows, but his actions on October 12th were not the product of any mental disease or defect, and you should so find.